Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Sarah Snyder. I'm the program director at the William E. Simon Foundation, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce today's speaker, Kay Hymowitz. Shortly, I will sit in rapt attention along with all of you as she discusses her latest book, The New Brooklyn: What It Takes to Bring a City Back. But let me briefly tell you how I have come to know and admire Kay. The William E. Simon Foundation started supporting Kay 13 years ago, and I know that I speak on behalf of the Foundation's president, Jim Pearson, and my colleague Janice Riddell, and all those who couldn't join us today, in saying that supporting Kay as the William E. Simon Fellow at the Manhattan Institute continues to be one of the proudest investments that we make each year. A quick overview of Kay's prolific work. She writes extensively on childhood, family issues, poverty, and cultural changes in America, and has authored 5 very successful books. She has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, New York Newsday, Public Interest, the Wilson Quarterly, and Commentary, among others. She is a highly sought-after presenter at conferences, on television, and on radio, and she sits on the board of National Affairs and the Future of Children. She holds degrees from Brandeis and Columbia Universities, and with a resume like that, I don't know when she has free time, but I know she does make it now that she's a doting grandma. Now, bear with me for a second as I tell a quick story. Back when Kay was thinking about what would eventually become her previous book, Manning Up, I was in the throes of being on the New York singles scene. Offhandedly, I told her I was so perplexed by the radio silence I was now getting from a fellow that I thought I was getting along with that I was even checking the obituaries to see if his name popped up. Thankfully, his name wasn't there, and as far as I know, it hasn't shown up, and I wish him well. I did find Mr. Right, and he had already worked through the man-child phase of life, as Kay had so pointedly coined in that last book, and we're currently working on expanding our family for a second time. Thank you. But more than a year after I'd mentioned my dating woes, Kay asked if she could use the example in her book. That's the point of my little story. It's Kay's skill to pick up on throwaway instances like my obituary story, collect them, and weave them into the bigger picture that examines a trend in society that makes her such an influential, successful, and interesting scholar. She is able to step back and see trends, both negative and positive, that the larger public is taking for granted, is too busy to notice, or simply doesn't want to acknowledge. Kay knows how to identify a problem in society, anticipate the future implications, and make recommendations on how to best address these trends with the interests of families at the core. She develops recommendations that resonate across the aisle, across the sexes, across skin tones, and across fiscal brackets. That is not an easy feat. Perhaps some of you share my inclination to drift off into a daydream when reading or listening to something that is too technical. I promise you won't do that today or any time you have the pleasure to engage with Kay's work. That is another beautiful aspect of her writing. She seamlessly weaves the evidence for policy recommendations into a story that her audience is actually interested in. The New Brooklyn examines the recent renaissance of Brooklyn through zoning reform, crime reduction, and the arrival of college-educated Americans, and what impact that has on the local populations. She helps the audience understand how this renaissance is not the first of its kind. Brooklyn started as farmland and was gentrified once before. The difference is this time the change is based on creative destruction rather than traditional industrialization. Chapters include research on the block-by-block split in Bed-Stuyvesant, where there are bars on one block and midnight shootings on the next, the work ethic of the Chinese in Sunset Park, the change in manufacturing in the Navy Yards from goods to ideas, the slow but steady mobility of the Jamaican population in Canarsie, the ghetto stigmas in East New York and Brownsville, the hipster population in Williamsburg, and the yuppies in Park Slope. Kay uses these examples to steer the conversation towards policies and cultural norms that can actually foster upward mobility among the urban poor. Stable families, job access, policing policies, housing, transportation, and education options. It's a page turner, and I'm sure you'll be transported across the river when Kay takes the podium here in a minute. But before I hand the mic over, I encourage anyone who does not have a copy of the book yet to stop in the back and get one at the end of the luncheon. And a very favorable review will be published in the February 5th edition of the New York Times Book Review. So, as you will learn, anything with the name Brooklyn in it is bound to please. And Kay will be happy to sign them. So please join me in welcoming somebody I greatly admire, Kay Hymowitz.
Well, I'm speechless. Fortunately, I have some notes in front of me. No, I mean, that was much too kind, Sarah. It has been such a pleasure to work with the Simon Foundation. In addition to being very generous towards me, they are just great fun. And I feel very, very warmly towards the entire crew there, including Sarah, of course. So in 1982, my husband and I bought a house in the Park Slope neighborhood of Brooklyn. When I tell people that these days, New Yorkers in particular, or wannabe New Yorkers, they get this look in their eye, and it looks a little bit to me like envy. So I can understand why. Park Slope, in 2010, the statistics guru, Nate Fisher, called Park Slope the best neighborhood in all of New York City. It is an amazing place to own a home, but I really have to admit to you that we don't feel that lucky. Lucky is the guy down the street who bought 2 houses. Of course, in 1982, when I told people I knew that I was buying a house in Brooklyn, they didn't look envious. They looked alarmed. Brooklyn was not the kind of place that a Jewish girl from suburban Philadelphia should aspire to live in. People who were leaving Brooklyn for the suburbs, not vice versa. And there were many moments over the next few years that I wondered what on earth we had been thinking. I think particularly of a moment in 1990 when the mother of my younger daughter's classmate had a gun put to her head as she exited the Q train after Christmas shopping in Manhattan. We took the Q train a lot and still do. In a lot of respects, the story of how Brooklyn came to this decrepit state resembles what we've heard repeatedly during the past election season about the failing cities and towns of Trump country in the Rust Belt and Appalachia. And I don't bring this up just because I, like everybody else, can't stop talking about the election. The parallel is real. For about 100 years, from the middle of the 19th to the middle of the 20th, Brooklyn was a thriving industrial city. If you look, by the way, each of you has a map, which unfortunately doesn't show you where the East River is, but I guess you can imagine where it is. And if you look, you will see in the sort of to the left of the middle is Prospect Park, and just to the left of that is Park Slope, which is where I live all these years later. At any rate, Brooklyn was a thriving industrial city, and if you think of this waterfront, see from Sunset Park to Red Hook, if you're going up the coast with me, all the way into the Navy Yard, Williamsburg, and Greenpoint. This part of Brooklyn was really where the story was, because in the days before there were planes and trains and automobiles, we were, of course, dependent on boats, and Brooklyn became a center even of trade, even before we had the, even before there were, motorboats or anything like that. It was all ships. The waterfront was crawling with bustling piers, warehouses, and factories. Nearby were a variety of tenement neighborhoods, most of them characterized by the predominantly Irish, German, Italian, or Jewish immigrant residents. Yes, Brooklyn really was an industrial powerhouse in those days, something that I had no idea of when I moved there. It had a multitude of coffee, shoe, and textile factories, sugar refineries, dozens of breweries. Innovated and entrepreneurs of the 19th and early 20th century, Brooklyn invented chiclets, the teddy bear, Benjamin and Moore, paints, and Domino sugar, to cite just a few. And in 1849, you'll like this one, a chemist named Charles Pfizer, one of the many German immigrants to arrive during that period, opened what would become one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. You probably know and revere Charles Pfizer's company for inventing such essential products of modern life as Zoloft, Lipitor, and let us not forget, Viagra. Over the years, companies like Pfizer's employed millions of immigrants, and Brooklyn neighborhoods and businesses grew to accommodate them. But the goddess of history is fickle, and Brooklyn's fortunes shifted in the second half of the 20th century. The factories that had sustained so many Americans started to leave, not for China and Mexico, as is the case today, but for far less crowded and more truck-friendly American suburbs and exurbs. In 1957, when Dodger owner Walter O'Malley broke the heart of every red-blooded Brooklynite by taking the beloved baseball team, Dem Bums, as they were referred to by locals, to Los Angeles. In retrospect, it seemed to foretell the borough's sorry fate. By the 1960s, the waterfront was becoming a sad, emptying shell of its former self. In 1966, the Navy Yard, which had during World War II had been the largest and best-known employer, was decommissioned. By the time I moved to Park Slope, about a mile away from the Navy Yard, it was home to a few operating warehouses, but mostly acres of empty buildings, feral dogs, and the occasional body that had been reportedly dumped by one of Brooklyn's legendary wise guys. There were still plenty of holdovers at the time that we moved in from the earlier waves of immigrants. Our next door neighbor were an elderly Irish couple who had once taken in boarders, as so many did in the brownstone areas of Brooklyn during the Depression and in the decades following. They were now being paid by the city of New York to house elderly, many of them sick and moaning, and that was the musical accompaniment of my children's early years. If I'm not sure, hopefully they can't remember it. In fact, Brooklyn was actually losing population. Years later, the writer Pete Hemmel, who grew up in working-class Park Slope, would say about this time, "You heard it over and over in those days, we gotta get out of Brooklyn." And you know what? A lot of people did. So the question that I had in my mind as I approached this book was, how did the old Brooklyn become the new Brooklyn? The place that GQ magazine called, and I still can't read this without laughing, the coolest city on the planet. How is it that when I moved to Park Slope, liquor stores have bulletproof cages to protect their cashiers, and they now have picture windows and free tastings of their expansive and expensive Pinot Noir selections? How could we have gotten to a point in history, as we did in the fall of 2015, where the fabled Parisian department store Bon Marché had spent a month celebrating Brooklyn mania with an exhibit called Brooklyn Rive Gauche? How could the always chic Parisians be so interested in buying products either made in Brooklyn or seeming as though they could be worn or eaten by a Brooklynite, or at least a Parisian's idea of a Brooklynite? And one final question: why should anyone care what happened to Brooklyn? The place isn't even a city, it's a borough. It has 2,600,000 people in a city of 8 million, in a country of 330 million. What's the big deal? What I try to show in the book is the reason we should be interested is that Brooklyn is a microcosm for the vast economic and social changes that have been roiling our politics, and it should be mentioned, the politics of Western Europe. Over the past 30 or 40 years, advanced economies like that of the United States have been shifting away from manufacturing, or to put it very crudely, making stuff, towards knowledge and information, or, again to be crude, thinking about stuff. New York City was already becoming the U.S. capital of that economy by the 1960s as corporations centralized and moved their headquarters to downtown and midtown. By the end of the 60s, 59% of the New York City labor force was in white-collar occupations. This gave New York a real competitive advantage over other fading industrial cities. Most of the people who were white-collar, and they were predominantly men who were working downtown, took the 5:15 train to New Rochelle, just like Rob Petrie, played by Dick Van Dyke, the fictional husband of Laura Petrie, played by Mary Tyler Moore, who I did want to mention today. But a few of those white-collar workers, especially the more creative types in media, started moving into largely working-class brownstone Brooklyn. They were gentrifying, to use a word that only became popular many decades later. Brooklyn Heights, Cobble Hill, Park Slope, perhaps you can trace those a little bit on your map. These were all lovely 19th century brownstone neighborhoods that had gone into disrepair. Over the next decades, the number of white-collar workers increased, as did the number and variety of white-collar jobs in New York. Government was expanding, and so were colleges and universities, and along with them, jobs for lawyers, administrators, and professors. By the 2000s, technology was opening up new occupations for the educated and creative young, including occupations people had never heard of before. The kiln operators at the Domino Sugar Refinery may be gone, but the new Brooklyn has many thousands of web designers, app developers, and social media consultants. And the house next door to me that I referred to earlier is a perfect illustration of the shift from the older to the new knowledge economy. It's really gentrification in a single brownstone. I already mentioned that there was an elderly Irish couple living there. The husband, like other immigrants who had been here long enough, had a civil service job, had been a postal worker, while his wife had been in charge of the borders, as I mentioned before. Fast forward 15 years. The house was sold, renovated, and subdivided into condominiums. Marble bathrooms, granite counters, recessed lighting, the whole deal. The first people to move in were people that you would never have met in the old Brooklyn. An architect and his wife, a furniture designer, an editor at Real Simple, and her husband, also an editor at a music magazine. A Wall Street trader, moved in soon after, with his wife, a freelance writer, and their 3 children. Same block, same house, old Brooklyn, new Brooklyn. Now, one thing that sometimes gets forgotten when people talk about gentrification and the shift from from the old to the new economy is that this shift also brought about very dramatic changes in domestic life. And these changes also helped to reverse Brooklyn's decline and, in fact, the decline of many other cities. First, the knowledge jobs in media, in design, law, and education were proving especially appealing to educated women, even after they became mothers. While a lot of young knowledge economy workers are drawn back to the suburbs once they start families and begin to take notice of the local public schools' performance, others are unwilling to tolerate the hour-long commute that worked well enough for their own fathers, who were often the single breadwinning parent. They want to live where they work, and we should add, they want their kids to be safe where they're living, and that the decline in crime that occurred in New York and Brooklyn, of course, in the 90s was really hastened the gentrification that had already begun in ways that have worked to Brooklyn's benefit and all of New York City. The second domestic change that is worth noting is that the knowledge economy, as its name suggests, demands higher levels of education from workers, as well as early career training in the form of internships and associate positions. That was leading young men and women to delay marriage and parenthood until they were well into their 20s and 30s. These educated singles, who don't need much living space and don't care all that much about their school district's test scores, gravitated to center cities with everything that they did care about. Lots of interesting jobs, bars, clubs, art galleries, and a large population of suitable romantic partners. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Brooklyn's story is far bigger than the borough itself. The same knowledge economy and educated young people are reshaping cities and ways of life in most advanced economies, from London to Copenhagen, Sydney to Philadelphia, Vancouver to Washington, D.C. College-educated young singles and professionals are moving into repurposed old factories and warehouses and glassy high-rises that might even have a rooftop swimming pool and a gym. Gentrification has launched a global aesthetic. You can go to almost any Western capital now and find your gentrified neighborhood, and it will have the same kinds of wine stores, farm-to-table infusion restaurants, music clubs, and again, art galleries. It's, to be honest, at times for travelers, a little interchangeable. So it's easy enough to poke fun at some of the new class of urban folk, especially those hipsters, with their endless number of stock signifiers, bike lanes, artisanal pickles, filament light bulb fixtures, slouchy wool hats, and statement facial hair. And to be honest, I engage in a little of that mockery myself. But the caricature, the irresistible caricature, misses something really important. These educated newcomers are bringing innovation back to stagnating cities. In Brooklyn, we are seeing the sort of creative dynamism that had largely disappeared from the borough by the 1930s. Some of the new companies moved into the very spaces built by the earlier generations of entrepreneurs. Greenpoint's Eberhard Faber pencil factory, for instance, has been transformed into the headquarters of the crowdsourcing website Kickstarter. In Brooklyn's Navy Yard, where carpenters and welders built some of the U.S. Navy's most fearsome battleships, makers are launching high-tech manufacturing ventures. Look at, again, at that waterfront that I mentioned earlier, along the East River and the New York Harbor, from Greenpoint in the north to Sunset Park in the southwest. This is Brooklyn's so-called creative crescent, where abandoned and underused warehouses are crammed with offices for 3D printer companies, biotech, robotics, and digital design companies. With, by the way, fantastic views of Manhattan and the harbor. Many of these young business people are what I call artist entrepreneurs. They are artists of all kinds who, with the help of computers, have found a way to pursue their métier while making a decent living. There are boutique businesses designing, making, and selling clothing, jewelry, shoes, soap, and stationery, and maps, like the one in front of you. There are also a stunning number of new businesses that are centered on food, I am happy to say. Restaurants, beer halls, tea shops, small batch or artisanal is the word, chocolates, granola, pickles, mustards, syrups, and takeout dinners to service an educated, well-traveled population with an adventurous palate and little time to cook. So that's the good news, as they say. But the transformation from an old to a new Brooklyn, from an industrial to a knowledge economy, and gentrification itself have not been nearly so kind to the urban working class and the poor. Though you would never know it from the popular media coverage, almost a quarter of Brooklyn lives below the poverty line. A similar number are on food stamps, while 32% have an income low enough to qualify for Medicaid. In the past, an industrial city like Brooklyn could absorb these lower-skilled immigrants into a large network of manufacturing and port-related companies. These were dirty, tedious, and sometimes dangerous jobs, but you didn't need an education to get one. In places like Brooklyn, you didn't even need to speak English, or at least Brooklyn's idea of English. As tough as the jobs were, they gave a foot up on the ladder up to the middle class. The question that I try to explore a bit in the book is whether Brooklyn can offer the same foothold to this generation of poor and working class as it did previous generations. It is really one of my central themes. Brooklyn today is seeing what is sometimes described as a manufacturing revival, but it is unlikely to perform the same service as the old manufacturing for the borough's less educated population. Traditional smokestack assembly line companies required by workers by the hundreds or even the thousands. Today's technologically sophisticated companies need only a small fraction of that number. President Trump needs to take notice. Those jobs that do appear in the want ads tend to require skills that are not in the repertoire of the people most in need of work. Low-wage service jobs with few benefits and unpredictable hours, wait staff, food preparers, hospital orderlies, and janitors, that's the kind of job mostly available now. Now, immigrants often take these jobs, if not happily, then eagerly. Some 39% of Brooklyn's population is foreign-born. This is something you could easily forget again if you're just reading about the hipsters of Brooklyn. Like the borough's immigrants from previous centuries, most arrive very poor. Along the major avenues traversing the borough from the East River waterfront toward the Atlantic Ocean, you can find people from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Haiti, Trinidad, Jamaica, to name only a few. Will they thrive? I profile the two largest immigrant groups in Brooklyn in two very different neighborhoods. The Jamaicans of Canarsie in the southeast and the Chinese of Sunset Park to their west. And I try to address that question. The Chinese are now the largest immigrant group in the borough, a fact that would stun the folks who had rooted for dem bums. In Sunset Park, newly arrived Chinese are frequently living 4 to a room and working in restaurants in near feudal conditions. And I don't exaggerate. I also don't exaggerate when I say that the fanatical devotion of the entire community towards children's education is so notable that newcomers learn the first word, Harvard. Second word, Stuyvesant. Those children look on track to leave their parents' poverty behind. But what I find in the chapter on Canarsie and the Jamaicans is that the picture is much more ambiguous. In parts of Bed-Stuy, in Brownsville, and East New York, Black poverty remains entrenched over generations. I devote a chapter to Brownsville, one of the most troubled neighborhoods in New York City. Its history is a fascinating one. Brownsville started as a Jewish ghetto, or slum in the parlance of Robert Moses and other urban planners of the mid-20th century. As blacks escaping the Jim Crow South moved into the area, the Jews did not flee, at least at first. Brownsville became an experiment in integration. The failure of that experiment and the continuing distress of the neighborhood are well worth understanding in more detail. So that should give you a sense of the breadth of the new Brooklyn. I would sum up this way. 35 years ago, after I moved to what real estate agents like to call transitional Park Slope, much of Brooklyn is prospering, presenting a remarkable picture of urban vitality as a new, well-fed, educated class takes full advantage of a knowledge-based, high-tech economy. But in poor and working-class immigrant neighborhoods, the picture is much cloudier. It's really inaccurate to reduce this to a tale of two cities, as our mayor has done. There are groups and individuals who will find pathways to the middle class and who are not part of the Dickensian inner city. The major task for policymakers, indeed for all of us, is to ensure that many more can move up in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay. Is that on? Yes? Okay, thank you. That was terrific.
Thank you, Sarah.
She's happy to take some questions. 3 rules. Wait for the mic, say your name, and ask a question, please. Heather. Okay.
Your mic. Thank you so much, Kay. That was fabulous. You mentioned policing as a precondition for this transformation. Were there other government policies that were necessary, or is this really just a spontaneous, I don't want to use the phrase free market because it's so loaded, but how would other cities go about this?
In my part of Brooklyn, in the brownstone areas, it really was kind of from the ground up. It was grassroots. It was people like me moving in and finding ways to renovate their homes. So it had, that was certainly not planned. However, there's been more planning going on as both city officials and developers began to realize what was happening. It took a while, by the way. One thing that the city did in the 90s was to give money or put a lot of money into the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which was, as I mentioned, a very sad shadow of its former self. The buildings were in terrible disrepair. The elevators didn't work. I mean, nobody could do business there, really, except for some warehouses. And they decided to upgrade the infrastructure. This was under Giuliani. And it took a little while, but by the late 90s, they were full. And they were full in part, though, again, because of this grassroots thing happening in Williamsburg and nearby creative communities where you had lots of young people who were interested in going into the maker business, as they call it. So it was a synergy in cases like that. There has been, as many of you probably know, some zoning drama in Brooklyn, particularly in Williamsburg, which I describe a bit. One of the problems that Brooklyn faces, but I think this is true for all of New York City, and in fact for cities around the country that are similarly crowded, is that the zoning makes it impossible to really expand and create more opportunities for more people. Look, there are a lot of people who would like to come to New York, and it's very difficult. It's going to be very difficult to do that with the prices for housing as high as they are.
Right here in the front. Sorry, we'll work our way around.
Hi, John Tierney with City Journal. A great speech.
Thanks, John.
Okay. I've always thought that, and have argued that Brooklyn would have been much better off as a separate city. Yeah. And I just wonder, when you talk about the zoning, the other stuff that is holding Brooklyn back. I used to be a neighbor of yours in Park Slope, yes. And I would walk across the Gowanus Canal with my son in the morning, and there was all this, these warehouses that could have been housing, and these idiot neighbors were fighting the developers, yeah. And there were people that wanted to live there, and New York zoning laws and all these other regulations. I mean, how much does that hurt Brooklyn now? Is the city holding it back? Because I think that its location, without New York's laws, it would have been, that would have come back much sooner, because yeah. It's just got a great location.
Yeah. John wrote an essay about this, which I stumbled across a year or two ago, which, what is it? Do you remember the name of it, the title?
Brooklyn could have been a contender.
Could have been a contender. Yeah, I love that. I love that. I knew it had a great title. And he makes the argument that Brooklyn never should have become part of New York City. Right? So we nurture iconoclastic views here. So, I think it's hard to answer. I would find it hard to believe that NIMBYism wouldn't be a problem if Brooklyn were its own city. It would still be a problem. I think that there are very few cities in the United States, and actually in the advanced economies where we are seeing a lot of gentrification, that have figured out how to deal with this problem of more people wanting to live in cities than places to house them. There are now waiting times of something like 40, I think the waiting list in Stockholm, I just read, it went up by 40%. The waiting time. So, and it's true in Amsterdam, it's true in Berlin, it's true, of course, in San Francisco, which is, as you probably know, one of the worst places. I think they passed a law in about 1960 that no building would be given a permit unless it was affordable housing, and guess what? There was no building. So, you know, the question that I try to deal with, or the way that I try to approach this problem is not to simply say more building, more building, more building, because that would be, you know, that really could relieve some of this problem. But I think what we're learning, and I've been thinking about this a lot since the election, is that people feel a certain attachment to a place and a sense of a way of life. And we can't completely ignore it and pave it over. Where we find the balance between that kind of nostalgia, to use a word that maybe is a little more critical than I mean to be, and the need for a vibrant new city is a question that I think is probably going to have to be dealt with case by case.
Sorry, here to the front table.
Hey, Michael.
Michael Myers, New York Civil Rights Coalition, Kay. Does your book at all refer to the race wars in Brooklyn?
Yes.
I remember when I think about Brooklyn, I think about the Ocean Hill-Brownsville school wars fight. I remember the Crown Heights Black and Jewish
Yes.
conflicts. I remember in Canarsie, the Black and Italian conflicts and the beatings and the violence. And on Church Avenue, the conflict between blacks and Koreans.
Yes.
Now, all this gentrification, has it changed and made a transition in terms of racial peace? What's going on in terms of racial conflicts?
I don't know that Brooklyn can be thought of in very different terms than a lot of cities in the United States when it comes to the racial tensions. I would say that the kinds of things you're talking about, which are, I do mention in various chapters depending on which neighborhood I'm talking about, we haven't seen anything quite like that in Brooklyn, and I would expect we wouldn't. I think one thing that's happened is that although the black population in Brooklyn has remained more or less at the same percentage, I think it's somewhere around 34% of the population, it's a different demographic. A lot of the black population is now immigrant from the West Indies and the Caribbean, and also from Africa. So, and I think also there are so many hues, so many different colors now, that some of the black-white binary is being broken down. And another thing that has happened that I was very interested to discover, in a neighborhood like Bed-Stuy, which has become, at least if you read the Brooklyn Press, you know, it's a center of gentrification. When I went to look at it, what I found was that, yes, there are some white educated newcomers in Bed-Stuy, and some of them are buying houses there, which, by the way, if you've never been to Bed-Stuy, has some of the most beautiful architecture, I think, in the city. However, what I also found was a lot of black middle class people, young people who were just coming back from college, wanted, just like my kids do, to be in the city. And some of them were starting businesses. It was quite interesting. I spoke to one woman who had gone, I think it was to the University of Chicago. And she said that when she got to Bed-Stuy, she couldn't find a decent coffee. And she said, when you're in law school, you live on coffee. So she wanted to recreate what she had at Chicago. And she set up the first, $4 or $5 coffee place in Bed-Stuy, which was blamed mostly on whites by locals, but actually it was not. So there are other trends going on that I think are breaking through some of the problems that we had in the past. Some of them.
Okay, we can go right up here at that table, then we'll go back.
David Musher. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about the decrease of crime in Brooklyn. You made the statement that there was a decrease of crime with the gentrification, that the people who came in didn't want to have the crime. Not wanting it doesn't make a decrease in crime, because certainly the people who live in the projects
Right.
don't want crime either.
Right.
Was it an epiphenomenon? Was there a cause and effect? How did it compare with the decrease in crime generally within the city of New York?
I think the decrease was very similar across New York. As many of you in this room know, Heather McDonald has done very important work on the decline of crime in New York and the policing revolution that seems to have played a big role in that. So that affected Brooklyn. It is interesting to me, and caught me a bit by surprise, that the gentrification of brownstone Brooklyn actually started before the crime decline. Certainly when I moved there, as I've said, I was not alone, there was still significant crime. But by the 1990s, we had Mayor Giuliani, and we had a revolution in the way policing was done. And by God, that crime really sank over the 90s. And there's research that just came out, I think it's from the Furman Center, saying that, in fact, safer communities, safer neighborhoods do promote gentrification. So I think the gentrification picked up as the crime declined, which, I found Heather persuasive on this, largely because of the policing revolution. It also lured in more people once the crime went down. And now you meet people, newcomers in my neighborhood, who they have no clue what it used to be like. And it's very hard. They look at you like, what? When you try to explain to them what it used to be like.
All right, we're going to go back over there.
Hi, Jim Epstein from Reason. The book, The Invention of Brownstone Brooklyn, talks a lot about, with the early gentrifiers in particular, this striving for authenticity.
Yes.
That a lot of these people were leaving Manhattan because they wanted to live next door to people like the Irish couple you described. I'm wondering, do you agree with that? And also, are there still any remnants of that looking for authenticity in the current gentrification waves we see?
Yeah. That's a wonderful book, by the way. I relied on it quite a bit for my chapter on Park Slope. There's no question that authenticity remains a Brooklyn word. It is something that you see thrown around all over the place. Now, the people who wanted to move next to or into an Irish neighborhood because they thought it was authentic, actually, am I doing? Yeah. It really didn't care for the aluminum siding that some of the, and the way that they kept their backyards with their laundry out there, and so there were tensions from the very, very beginning, I quote some of the old-timer immigrants. They were not particularly happy with this new group of what they called beatniks, which I love. Some of them professors and lawyers, but no, at any rate, so they thought of them as beatniks. And those tensions, I think, are still there, and I think a lot of what the gentrification drama is about, it has to do with the idea that we are changing what's authentic about Brooklyn and turning it into something homogenous. Remember, one of the things, if you've read the book that Jim is referring to, the people who moved to Brooklyn at first really wanted kind of city living, in the sense that they wanted to be able to walk places, and they didn't like the suburbs. This was a very conscious revolt against suburban living by this new crowd. I know it was, by the way, for me. My husband and I had been living in Westchester when we moved to Brooklyn. I didn't want to be in the suburbs, and many of the people I knew felt the same way. They thought of city living as somehow more authentic. The suburbs were sterile, too orderly, not diverse enough, of course, and so on. So yes, I would say the authenticity issue becomes, is not only still very much prominent in the discussion, but it's a word that really has not gotten the kind of self-examination that it needs, because it is leading to a kind of foolishness about what the real, Park Slope or the real Bed-Stuy is. The real Bed-Stuy is basically what it was like when you moved in, even if it was just 2 years ago.
Stanley Goldstein, that was an excellent talk.
Thank you.
The borough of Brooklyn was helped by two fine mayors, Giuliani and Bloomberg, and the Bronx had the same two mayors. Can you guess two things? One is, why didn't the Bronx benefit? But second, there's an article in the City Journal about taller is better for cities. Would tall buildings now help the Bronx?
Well, I have one or two thoughts about that. The original gentrification, as I mentioned, in Brooklyn was started in the brownstone areas, and people liked the look of those areas. There's not that much of that in the Bronx. I think, I actually don't know this for sure, maybe Heather knows. The crime, did it come down as fast? And it did come down as fast in Bronx, so it wasn't the crime. So I think it was partly had to do with that, the building's infrastructure in Brooklyn. The neighborhoods were really like neighborhoods in a way that is sometimes the case in the Bronx, but not always. In addition, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, because I don't know the Bronx all that well. My sense is that the housing projects, and many of them tallish, are scattered all around the Bronx. Now, we have in Brooklyn many housing projects. And in fact, one of the reasons that Brownsville, the community I spoke about earlier that remains in such distress, I believe is because there are so many. It's like the largest concentration of housing projects in the country. So when you have that kind of built environment, it's not going to attract a lot of new people. So I'm guessing a little bit, or speculating here, that this is part of what's held the Bronx back as well. But more generally, the housing stock, I think, is just not as appealing.
All right, we have time for one more, and then I'm volunteering Kay to stay after to answer anybody we don't get to. So go right here.
Marshall Jaffe. Do you think that the presence of stable urban, ethnic enclaves like the Chinese in Sunset Park, or even the Italians in, Bensonhurst, is that a prerequisite for this kind of urban gentrification, rejuvenation?
Well, I don't think it's a prerequisite for gentrification, but it has been a prerequisite for immigrants to eventually assimilate, if it's done the right way. I mean, all of the immigrants who came to the United States, almost all, who came to New York, went to the areas where their people were, and they provided social networks that were absolutely essential for finding jobs, for figuring out what to make of this strange food and money and all of that stuff. In addition, the enclave was really an educational institution for newcomers. The problem that we find today, and I can't give you a simple answer anymore that the enclave is a good thing, because it depends on the enclave. There are enclaves where the culture of that particular community is not helping to create the next generation of successful students and citizens. So what I found in Canarsie was the Jamaicans who I write about are extremely hardworking, very, very committed to owning a home. I mean, Canarsie has one of the largest home ownership rates in the city. And yet, the families don't, they want their kids to achieve in school, but they don't, unlike the Chinese, they haven't figured out how to do it. And there's an assumption, which turns out to be false, that the schools are will do the job, and they can put their kids in the schools and turn their backs. Now, the schools today, I don't need to tell anybody sitting here, are not going to do that for an awful lot of kids. And the difference between now and earlier generations of immigrants is not just that the schools are worse, although I suspect they are, but that education has become much more important to getting into the middle class. So you have low-skilled immigrants, which we've always had, but instead of being able to move up the ladder through the industrial sector, they are going to have to go through the knowledge economy, which means they've got to be successful in school. And that's not happening in an awful lot of enclaves.
Please join me in thanking Kay.
Thank you.